The moment my son shoved my chair backward at Christmas dinner, the entire table went silent. I still remember the sound of the chair legs scraping across the hardwood floor before Michael looked me dead in the eyes and said, cold as ice, "That seat is for Lauren's father. Get up." For a second, I thought he was joking, but nobody laughed. Not my daughter in law, not her wealthy parents, not even my own son after he watched me struggle to keep my balance at 67 years old. And standing there beside that table I once dreamed of filling with love, I realized something horrifying. I was no longer welcome in my own family. If you've ever been hurt by someone you sacrificed everything for, I want you to stay with me until the end of this story. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like a stranger inside your own family? Please like and subscribe if stories like this touch your heart. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Tonight, I think a lot of us could use someone to talk to. 3 days before Christmas, I was standing in my kitchen peeling potatoes when my phone rang for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. I looked at the screen and froze when I saw Michael's name. For a moment, I just stared at it. My son used to call me every Sunday morning without fail. Back when he was younger, he'd even stop by unexpectedly after work just to raid my refrigerator and complain about traffic. But after he married Lauren Whitaker 4 years ago, the calls became shorter, then rarer, then almost non-existent. I wiped my hands on a towel before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. Not the warm kind, not the kind where someone is smiling on the other end. Just silence. "Hey, Mom," he finally said. His voice sounded distracted, tired maybe. I tried not to sound too eager. "How are you?" "Busy. You know, holiday stuff." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My small house in Albuquerque was so quiet these days that sometimes I caught myself talking out loud just to hear another voice. "Well," I said gently, "I'm glad you called." Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. "Lauren and I are hosting Christmas dinner this year. You should come." For a second, my heart actually lifted. It embarrassed me how quickly hope could still bloom inside me after months of being ignored. "Oh," I said softly. "Really?" "Yeah." No excitement, no warmth, just obligation. But I grabbed onto the invitation anyway. "I'd love to come." "Dinner's at 6, he said. "And Mom?" "Yes, don't come too early, okay? Lauren's parents will already be here helping set up." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Not rude exactly, just careful, as if I needed to be managed. Still, I smiled to myself after we hung up. I told myself I was imagining things. Families went through phases, marriage changed dynamics. Maybe Michael was stressed because of work. I wanted to believe that. God help me, I really did. That night, I pulled down the old Christmas storage boxes from the garage attic by myself. Miguel used to do that for me before arthritis settled into my knees and before cancer took him away 3 winters ago. Sometimes I still expected to hear his boots by the front door. Still expected him to walk into the kitchen asking if I'd made coffee. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by ornaments, while old Spanish Christmas music played softly from my radio. Every ornament carried a memory. Michael in second grade, making crooked paper snowflakes. Miguel burning the tamales, because he insisted he could cook just as well as any woman. The year we barely had enough money for gifts, so we wrapped books from the thrift store in newspaper comics to make Michael laugh. Back then we had almost nothing, but our home was full. That was before appearances started mattering, before Michael met the Whitakers. The Whitakers lived in one of the richest neighborhoods in Santa Fe. Lauren's father, Edward Whitaker, owned several luxury commercial properties and loved reminding people about it. The first time Miguel met him, we'd barely gotten through appetizers before Edward asked what college Michael had attended. When Michael admitted he'd gone to community college while working construction, Edward smiled politely and said, "Well, not everyone needs an Ivy League education, I suppose." I still remembered how Miguel's jaw tightened that night. My husband had worked 16-hour days laying tile and drywall so our son could have opportunities we never had. And Edward had dismissed him in one sentence. Miguel never forgot it. Neither did I. The next morning, I drove across town to pick up Michael's Christmas gift from the jeweler. Inside the small velvet box was Miguel's silver watch. It wasn't expensive compared to the watches Edward Whittaker probably owned, but Miguel had worn it every day for nearly 30 years. When he died in the hospital, the nurse placed it in my hand. I'd kept it hidden ever since. Now I was finally ready to give it to our son. At least I thought I was. Later that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, putting together an old photo album for Michael. Pictures slipped through my fingers like pieces of another lifetime. Michael at age 7 missing his front teeth. Michael holding his first baseball glove. Miguel teaching him how to drive in our old Ford truck. I stopped at one picture in particular. It showed Miguel and Michael standing in front of the small construction office Michael owned now. I remembered that day clearly because Miguel and I had quietly emptied nearly half our savings account to help Michael open that business. We never told anyone, especially not Lauren's family. Michael had begged us not to. Edward already thinks I'm not good enough for Lauren, he'd said. I don't want him knowing I needed help. Miguel agreed to keep the secret because he loved our son. But after we gave Michael the money, Miguel made him sign paperwork acknowledging it as a family loan. Not because we planned to collect, but because Miguel believed responsibility mattered. You never help someone by teaching them entitlement, he used to say. At the time, Michael signed the papers without complaint. Back then, he still looked at us with gratitude in his eyes. Around 8 that evening, my phone buzzed again. Lauren. I straightened automatically before answering. Hi, Lauren. Hi, Krista, she said in that perfectly controlled voice of hers. Not cold, not warm, just polished. I wanted to go over Christmas dinner logistics really quickly. Logistics? As if I were a catering delivery. Of course, I said. There'll be a few business associates stopping by before dinner, so parking may be tight. And my mother's very particular about table arrangements this year. I frowned slightly. Table arrangements? Yes. We're trying to keep things formal. Something in her tone made me suddenly feel self-conscious about everything from my old winter coat to the wrapped gifts sitting beside the couch. Then she added casually, and please don't bring any homemade food this time. My mother already hired a chef. I looked down at the fresh masa dough resting on my kitchen counter. I'd spent all afternoon making tamales, Michael's favorite since childhood. Oh, I whispered. Silence stretched between us. Then Lauren sighed lightly, almost impatiently. We just want everything to go smoothly. Smoothly. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat. Of course, I said again. After we hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen for a very long time. The house suddenly felt too quiet, too still. Snow had started falling outside the window in soft white sheets, covering the neighborhood in Christmas light reflections. I looked at the tamales cooling on the counter, then at Miguel's watch sitting inside its velvet box. And for the first time since Michael invited me, a strange feeling settled deep in my stomach. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The feeling that I was being invited somewhere I no longer belonged. Christmas Day arrived cold and bright, with sunlight reflecting sharply off the snow-covered sidewalks outside my house. I spent almost an hour getting ready, which probably sounds foolish for a 67-year-old woman attending dinner at her own son's home. But when you haven't felt wanted in a long time, even small invitations begin to feel important. I curled my silver gray hair carefully and wore the dark green sweater Miguel used to say brought out my eyes. I even put on lipstick, though I rarely bothered anymore. Then I wrapped Michael's gifts one last time. The photo album, Miguel's watch, and the container of tamales I decided to bring anyway. I knew Lauren told me not to, but some stubborn part of me refused to arrive empty-handed to my own family's Christmas dinner. The drive to Santa Fe took a little over an hour because of the snow. Christmas lights glowed from rooftops all along the highway, and for a moment I let myself pretend everything would be okay. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe Michael had just been stressed lately. Maybe this dinner would fix everything. Hope can make fools out of mothers. When I finally pulled into Michael's driveway, my stomach tightened immediately. Luxury cars lined the street. A valet attendant stood near the entrance. I actually checked the house number to make sure I was at the right place. The home looked different from the last time I'd visited 6 months earlier. New stone landscaping, designer lanterns, expensive outdoor furniture covered lightly in snow. Everything screamed money, and somehow none of it felt like my son. I picked up my gifts carefully and walked toward the front door. Before I could knock it open, Lauren stood there in a cream-colored dress with diamond earrings sparkling beneath the entryway chandelier. "Oh," she said, sounding surprised to see me exactly on time. "Hi, Krista." "Merry Christmas," I said warmly. She leaned forward stiffly to air kiss my cheek without touching me. "You made it safely." Behind her, I could already hear laughter filling the house. Rich laughter, confident laughter, the kind that comes from people who have never worried about overdraft fees or medical bills. I stepped inside slowly. The house smelled like expensive candles and catered food. Not cinnamon, not roasted chilies, not home. Lauren glanced at the foil-covered tray in my hands. "You brought food?" "Just tamales," I said softly. "Michael always loved well." She forced a smile. The chef already finalized the menu. I swallowed. Of course. Before I could say more, a booming male voice interrupted from the living room. There's the Gonzales matriarch Edward Whitaker emerged holding a glass of wine. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly tailored sweater. The kind of man who always looked like he belonged in magazine advertisements about wealth management. Beside him stood Patricia Whitaker, elegant and expressionless in pearls. Edward hugged me with exaggerated politeness. "Krista," he said loudly, still driving that old Honda. I smiled tightly. "It still works." "Well," he chuckled. "That's one way to save money." Patricia gave me a thin smile before her eyes drifted toward my coat. "I do hope the roads from Albuquerque weren't too difficult," she said. "Though I suppose you're used to long drives?" I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but it felt insulting anyway. Then I saw Michael. My son stood near the dining room, talking to two men in expensive suits. For one beautiful second, his face softened when he saw me. Mom. There he is, I thought. My boy. He walked over and hugged me quickly with one arm. Not tightly, not lovingly, just briefly. Still, I held on to that tiny moment like it mattered. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." "You too." He glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "Hey, thanks for coming." "Thanks for coming." Not, "I'm happy you're here." I pushed the thought away. "I brought your gift," I said with a smile. "Mom, you didn't have to. I wanted to." Before he could answer, Edward called him back toward the businessmen. Michael immediately turned away. "I'll be right back." And just like that, I was standing alone again. I spent the next hour feeling like an accidental guest at someone else's party. Every conversation seemed to circle around investments, luxury vacations, and people I didn't know. Lauren floated effortlessly through the room, refilling wine glasses, while Patricia complimented the catering. Nobody asked about my life. Nobody asked how I'd been spending the holidays since Miguel died. At one point, I overheard Edward speaking proudly to one of the guests. "Michael's learning quickly," he said. "I've been helping him refine his image. Business is all about perception. Image." The word sat bitterly in my chest. Later, I slipped quietly into the kitchen to place the tamales on the counter. One of the catering staff looked confused. "I don't think these were approved for service." "Approved?" I almost laughed. "It's fine," I whispered. "Just leave them here." As I turned around, I noticed Michael standing in the doorway. For a second, his eyes landed on the tray, and I saw something flicker across his face. Memory? Childhood? Love. "You still make them the same way?" he asked quietly. "Your father's recipe," I said. His expression softened briefly. Then Lauren appeared beside him. "Dinner's ready," she announced brightly, And just like that, the softness vanished. Everyone gathered around the massive dining table, decorated with gold candles and crystal glasses. I hesitated before sitting down. There was one empty chair beside Michael, the seat I had sat in every Christmas since he was a little boy. So naturally, instinctively, I moved toward it. I had barely touched the chair when Michael's hand suddenly grabbed the back of it. Hard. The chair jerked backwards so sharply that I nearly lost my balance. The room went silent. At first, I thought maybe something was wrong. Then Michael looked directly at me, not embarrassed, not apologetic, cold. "That seat is for Lauren's father," he said flatly. "You can sit over there." He pointed toward the far end of the table, near the kitchen entrance. Away from him, away from everyone. For a second, I genuinely couldn't breathe. I stared at my son, waiting for him to smile, waiting for him to say he was joking, but he didn't. Nobody did. Lauren adjusted her napkin silently. Patricia sipped her wine, and Edward slowly lowered himself into the chair that had just been taken from me. My chair. The chair beside my son. The chair beside family. Heat rushed into my face so quickly I thought I might faint. My voice cracked. I didn't realize. Michael avoided my eyes. It just makes more sense this way. Makes more sense. As if love could be rearranged like table decorations. As if mothers became disposable once richer people arrived. I became painfully aware of every tiny sound in the room. Silverware clinking, fire crackling, someone coughing awkwardly. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. And somehow that silence hurt worse than the humiliation itself. I nodded slowly because I refused to cry in front of those people. Refused. So I picked up my napkin with shaking hands and walked toward the lonely chair waiting at the far corner of the table. The servant's seat. That's what it felt like. As I sat down, Edward smiled comfortably beside my son, while Michael immediately began discussing business with him again. Like nothing had happened. Like pushing his widowed mother aside on Christmas was perfectly normal. And sitting there at the edge of that glowing holiday table, surrounded by expensive strangers and my own silent child, I realized something devastating. The Whitakers hadn't taken my place in Michael's life overnight. They had been slowly replacing me for years, and I had been too blinded by love to see it happening. I don't remember leaving the dining room. To this day, the entire moment feels blurred around the edges, like a nightmare. My mind tried to soften out of mercy. I remember the sound of forks scraping plates, Edward laughing at something Michael said, Lauren smiling politely at her mother, and me, sitting there at the far end of the table, staring at a flickering candle while my food went cold. Nobody looked at me. Not really. I could have disappeared completely, and I honestly don't think anyone at that table would have noticed for several minutes. At one point, Michael glanced toward me briefly. Our eyes met, and instead of shame, I saw irritation, as if my hurt feelings were inconveniencing him. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not loudly, quietly, like ice splitting beneath heavy weight. I stayed through dessert because dignity sometimes means surviving humiliation without giving cruel people the satisfaction of seeing you break. But the second coffee was served, I stood up. "I should head home," I said softly. Lauren barely looked up. Already Edward checked his watch dramatically. "Well, Albuquerque is quite a drive," Patricia added, "especially at your age." I waited for Michael to say something. Anything. "Stay a little longer. I'll walk you out." "I'm sorry." Instead, he simply nodded. "Drive safe. Drive safe." That was all my son had left for me after publicly humiliating me on Christmas. I picked up my coat slowly because my hands had started trembling. The photo album still sat unopened near the tree. Miguel's watch still wrapped inside its velvet box. Nobody had even asked about the gifts. As I reached the front door, Michael finally followed me into the hallway. For one weak, hopeful second, I thought maybe he'd come to apologize privately. Instead, he lowered his voice and said, "Mom, you kind of made things awkward tonight." I stared at him. I made things awkward. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. You know Edward's old-fashioned about hosting arrangements? Hosting arrangements. I almost laughed from disbelief. You pushed me, I whispered. I barely touched the chair. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. His jaw tightened instantly. Why does everything have to become emotional with you? That sentence hurt more than the chair, more than the silence. Because once upon a time, Michael used to cry if he saw me upset. Now my pain annoyed him. I'm your mother, I said quietly, and you're acting like I attacked you over a chair. I looked at him for a very long time then. Really looked at him. At the expensive sweater Edward probably bought him. At the tension behind his eyes. At the exhaustion he tried to hide beneath confidence. And suddenly, beneath all my heartbreak, I saw something else. Fear. Michael was afraid of those people. Afraid of disappointing them. Afraid of losing whatever approval they dangled in front of him. But understanding someone's weakness doesn't erase the damage they cause. I should go, I said. He exhaled sharply, like he was relieved the conversation was ending. That nearly destroyed me. As he opened the front door, cold wind rushed inside, carrying the scent of snow and pine trees. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said automatically. I turned toward him one last time. "Merry Christmas." Michael. Then I walked out into the dark. The drive home felt longer than usual. Snow fell heavily across the highway, while Christmas songs played softly through the radio speakers, like cruel little reminders of happier years. About halfway home, I had to pull over because I couldn't see through my tears anymore. I parked near an empty gas station and gripped the steering wheel while sobs tore through my chest so violently it physically hurt. I cried for Miguel. I cried for my son. I cried for the woman I used to be before loneliness became normal. But mostly I cried because deep down, I finally understood something I'd been refusing to admit for years. Michael wasn't slowly drifting away from me. He had already left. The snow kept falling outside my windshield while memories crashed through my mind one after another. Michael at age 9, running into my arms after losing a baseball game. Michael at 16, promising he'd always take care of me someday. Michael standing beside Miguel's hospital bed, crying so hard he could barely breathe. Back then, grief had made us closer, or at least I thought it had. Maybe I had mistaken dependence for love. By the time I reached home, it was nearly midnight. The house greeted me with silence. No lights, no laughter, no husband waiting in his recliner. Just silence. I stepped inside slowly and set the untouched gifts on the kitchen counter. Then I finally noticed the tray of tamales still sitting in my back seat through the window. I had forgotten them entirely. Michael's favorite Christmas food in the world. Never served. Never wanted. Something about that broke me all over again. I carried the tray inside and stood alone in my kitchen staring at it. Then, without thinking, I opened the trash can lid. I almost threw them away, but Miguel's voice suddenly echoed inside my memory so clearly it stopped me cold. Never destroy something made with love, mi corazón, even if the wrong people fail to appreciate it. I burst into tears again, this time harder. I sank slowly into one of the kitchen chairs while grief and humiliation crashed through me in waves. After a while, I wiped my face and looked toward the hallway closet. The box? Miguel's box? For 3 years, I had barely touched it. After his death, I couldn't bear to go through the documents he left behind. Every paper smelled faintly of his cologne and carried memories I wasn't strong enough to face. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside me had shifted. I walked slowly to the closet and pulled the heavy storage box onto the dining table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were folders, bank documents, old business records, insurance papers, and handwritten notes in Miguel's familiar, messy handwriting. At the very top rested a sealed envelope, my name written across the front, Krista. Just seeing his handwriting made my throat tighten. I sat down carefully before opening it. Inside was a letter. The paper shook slightly in my hands as I began reading. Mi amor, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. and I fear Michael may have become the kind of man I prayed he never would. My entire body went still. I kept reading. I know our son loves deeply, but he also fears deeply. And fearful men can be manipulated by people who measure worth in money and status. Edward Whittaker worries me. There was more, much more, pages of it. Miguel wrote about conversations he'd had with Michael during the first year of his marriage, about financial pressure, about insecurity, about the way Michael constantly compared himself to Lauren's wealthy family. Then I reached the sentence that made my stomach drop. I made Michael sign legal acknowledgement forms for every major financial transfer we gave him. Copies are included in the blue folder. I looked up slowly. Blue folder. Heart pounding, I searched through the box until I found it. Inside were copies of bank transfers totaling nearly $200,000 over 8 years. Down payments, business loans, mortgage assistance, and beneath them all, Michael's signature. I stared at those papers in stunned silence. All these years, I thought Miguel simply wanted our son to learn responsibility. But now, reading the final page of the letter, I realized the truth. Miguel had been preparing for this exact moment. And suddenly, for the first time since Christmas dinner began, I no longer felt powerless. I felt awake. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's hand shoving my chair backward across the floor. Then I'd hear Miguel's voice from the letter all over again. Fearful men can be manipulated by people who measure worth in money and status. At 4:30 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep entirely and made coffee instead. The house was dark except for the soft glow of Christmas lights blinking in my living room window. Usually the morning after Christmas felt peaceful to me. Quiet, sacred almost, but this morning felt different, like the beginning of something I couldn't yet fully understand. I carried my coffee back to the dining table, where Miguel's documents still lay spread out in careful stacks. For hours, I read every single page: bank transfers, loan agreements, business records, even handwritten notes Miguel had attached to certain documents. One note stopped me cold. Michael requested another extension. Says cash flow is unstable. Edward, encouraging expansion anyway. I frowned. Another page revealed a large transfer from Miguel's retirement account 6 years earlier, the exact year Michael bought his current home in Santa Fe. $120,000. My breath caught. I remembered that year clearly. Michael had told us the Whitakers were helping with the house purchase. But according to these papers, Miguel and I had quietly covered most of the down payment ourselves. And Michael knew it. There was even a signed acknowledgement form attached beneath the transfer. I stared at my son's signature for a long time. Not because of the money. God knows parents sacrifice for their children every day without expecting repayment. That was never the point. The point was that Michael had allowed people like Edward Whittaker to treat us like small, unimportant outsiders while standing on a foundation we helped build. The realization hurt more deeply than I could explain. Around 8 in the morning, my phone rang. Angela Ruiz. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 2 months. Angela and I became friends years ago when her husband worked construction jobs with Miguel. Unlike most lawyers, Angela never acted superior to ordinary people. She still lived in the same modest neighborhood, despite becoming one of the most respected attorneys in Albuquerque. Krista, she answered immediately after I picked up. Merry Christmas, honey. I almost laughed at the irony. Merry Christmas? She paused. What happened? That was Angela. She always knew. I tried to answer calmly, but the second I opened my mouth, tears started sliding down my face again. By the time I finished telling her everything, nearly 20 minutes had passed. Silence filled the phone line for a moment. Then Angela said quietly, "That boy's father would be heartbroken." I looked toward Miguel's letter sitting beside me. He already knew something like this might happen. What do you mean? So I told her about the documents, the loans, the signed papers, the trust records. Another long silence followed. Finally, Angela said, "Don't touch anything. I'm coming over." 2 hours later, she sat across from me at my kitchen table, wearing jeans, boots, and a heavy winter coat, while carefully reviewing the documents one by one. The deeper she read, the more serious her expression became. At one point, she removed her glasses slowly and looked at me. Krista, do Michael and the Whitakers know about all of this? I don't think so. And Miguel never told you the full details. I shook my head. He said he wanted to protect me if anything ever happened to him. But after he died, I couldn't bring myself to go through the paperwork. Angela leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. Your husband was smarter than people realized. I smiled sadly. He usually was. Angela tapped one of the folders. These aren't informal family gifts. Legally speaking, many of these transfers were documented as loans and protected financial interests. My stomach tightened. What does that mean exactly? It means, she said carefully, you have far more leverage than Michael probably realizes. I hated hearing the word leverage connected to my son. Even after everything that happened, part of me still wanted to protect him. Angela seemed to notice. Krista, she said gently, you need to stop thinking like a guilty mother for 5 minutes and start thinking like a woman who's being taken advantage of. I looked down at my coffee. I never cared about the money. I know that. Then why does this feel so ugly? Because betrayal always does. Her words settled heavily between us. Angela continued flipping through the documents until she suddenly stopped. Wait. She pulled out a thin folder, tucked near the bottom of the box. Inside were property records connected to Michael's house. Angela's eyebrows lifted slightly as she read, well now. What she handed me the page. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then slowly the legal wording began making sense. Miguel had structured part of the down payment assistance through a protected family lien arrangement, not full ownership, but enough legal interest to matter, enough to prevent certain refinancing actions without acknowledgement. My heart began pounding. Michael never mentioned this. I'm guessing Edward doesn't know either, Angela said quietly. Can they remove it? Not without dealing with you first. I stared at the papers in stunned silence. All these years, I thought Miguel had simply been cautious. Now I realized he'd been preparing for war, and somehow that realization terrified me. Because Miguel had loved our son more than anything in this world. If even he believed Michael might someday betray us, what had he seen that I refused to? Angela softened her voice. Tell me honestly. When did Michael start changing? I thought about that for a long moment. The engagement, I finally whispered. Angela nodded slowly. That tracks. I looked confused. She sighed. Krista, men like Edward Whitaker don't just influence finances. They influence identity. Your son spent his entire life feeling working class. Then suddenly he's surrounded by wealth status private clubs, expensive vacations. He started feeling ashamed, I whispered. Yes. The word hit me like a punch. Ashamed. Not of himself, of us. I thought about the way Michael used to avoid discussing his childhood around Lauren's family. How he slowly stopped speaking Spanish at family gatherings. How he traded homemade birthday dinners for expensive restaurants. Tiny changes, small compromises, until eventually I no longer recognized him. Angela reached across the table and squeezed my hand. This isn't your fault. But I raised him. You raised a loving boy. Somewhere along the way, he became a frightened man. Tears burned my eyes again. I don't know what to do. Angela was quiet for a moment. Then she asked softly, what do you want? The answer came immediately. I want my son back. And that was the saddest part of all, because deep down, I already knew the truth. The version of Michael I missed might not exist anymore. Just then, my phone buzzed across the table. Michael. Angela looked at me carefully. You don't have to answer. But I did, because no matter how much pain he caused me, he was still my child. I picked up the phone slowly. Hello? Michael's voice sounded tense. Mom, we need to talk. Not Mom. I'm sorry. Not, are you okay? Just, we need to talk. And suddenly, with Miguel's documents spread across my table, and Angela silently watching me from across the room, I had a terrible feeling I already knew exactly what my son wanted. Michael arrived at my house the next afternoon just before sunset. I saw his black SUV pull into the driveway while I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes that didn't really need washing. Anxiety had kept me moving all day. Angela had already left that morning, but not before warning me carefully. Do not let guilt make decisions for you, Krista. I promised her I wouldn't. But promises become fragile when your child knocks on your door. Michael walked in without waiting long after I opened it, carrying cold air and the faint smell of expensive cologne into the house. For a second, memories collided painfully inside me. The little boy who used to run into this kitchen asking for hot chocolate. The teenager who once hugged me after his first heartbreak. The grown man who pushed my chair away on Christmas. All three versions of him stood in front of me at once. "Hi," he said stiffly. "Hi." Neither of us hugged the other. That alone told me how broken things had become. "You want coffee?" I asked automatically. "Sure." I turned toward the counter while he wandered awkwardly into the living room. His eyes scanned the house absently, almost distracted. Or maybe uncomfortable. The Christmas decorations still glowed softly around the room. Miguel's old ornaments hung from the tree beside handmade decorations Michael created as a child. I wondered if he even noticed them anymore. When I carried the mugs into the living room, Michael remained standing. "I can't stay long," he said immediately. "Straight to business." "Of course." I sat down slowly. "What did you need to talk about?" He rubbed the back of his neck before answering. "There's some paperwork I need your help with." There it was. Not an apology. Not regret. Paperwork. I kept my expression calm, even though disappointment settled heavily in my chest. "What kind of paperwork?" Michael finally sat across from me, leaning forward with restless energy. "The company's restructuring some financing," he explained quickly. "The bank's reviewing old liabilities and personal loan disclosures." I said nothing. He continued too fast, like someone rehearsing lines. "Basically, they need clarification that the money you and Dad gave me over the years wasn't formal debt." My stomach tightened. There it is, I thought. He knows. Or at least partially knows. Michael pulled several papers from a leather folder and slid them across the coffee table. "If you just sign these acknowledgement forms saying everything was gifted voluntarily, it cleans things up." I didn't touch the documents. Instead, I looked directly at my son. "When were you planning to apologize to me?" The question hit him like a slap. His eyes narrowed immediately. "Mom?" "No," I interrupted softly. "Answer me." He exhaled sharply and leaned back against the couch. "I already told you things got awkward at dinner. You humiliated me." His jaw clenched. "You're exaggerating." I stared at him in disbelief. Exaggerating. That word physically hurt. "I'm exaggerating because my son shoved me away from the family table on Christmas. I didn't shove you. You removed me from my seat so your father-in-law could take my place." Michael's frustration visibly grew. "You're making this symbolic when it wasn't." It was symbolic to me. Silence filled the room heavily. Outside, snow drifted softly across the windows, while my son looked at me like I was becoming an obstacle instead of a person. Finally, he rubbed his face tiredly. "Look, can we not do this right now? I'm already under enough pressure." Pressure. That word again. Always pressure. Always stress. Always excuses. I studied him quietly. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His shoulders looked tense, even while sitting still. There was a nervousness in him I hadn't fully noticed before Christmas. Not confidence. Desperation. "What's going on with the business?" I asked suddenly. His head snapped up. "What, you heard me. Nothing's going on. Michael." His expression hardened immediately. "Why are you asking?" "Because your father warned me," I thought. "Because I'm finally paying attention." Instead, I answered carefully. "You seem scared." That offended him instantly. "I'm not scared." "Then why do you look miserable every time Edward's around?" The room went completely still. Michael's eyes flashed with anger. You don't understand how business works. Then explain it to me. He stood abruptly and began pacing. You think everything is simple because you and Dad spent your whole lives settling for less. The words landed like a knife, but I stayed silent. Maybe because deep down, I sensed this wasn't really about me anymore. This was about the war happening inside him. Michael continued pacing while emotion slowly cracked through his controlled voice. Do you know what it's like being around people like the Whitakers? People who built real wealth, real influence. Your father built everything we had with his own hands. That's not the same. I flinched slightly. Michael saw it. For one brief second, guilt crossed his face. Then pride buried it again. You have no idea how humiliating it feels walking into those rooms sometimes. He muttered, everybody judging where I came from, how I talk, what school I went to. Suddenly, I understood something painful. Michael wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing worth. And Edward Whittaker knew exactly how to exploit that hunger. What does Edward want from you? I asked quietly. Michael stopped pacing instantly. Nothing. Michael, he's helping me expand the company? At what cost? His silence answered me. Slowly, I leaned forward. What aren't you telling me? He looked away toward the darkened window. The market shifted this year, he admitted reluctantly. A couple commercial projects stalled. Cash flow got tight. How tight? He hesitated too long. Michael, we're leveraged. Fear crawled slowly into my chest. How leveraged, he finally looked at me. Edward connected me with private investors. My stomach dropped. Private investors rarely meant anything good when desperation entered the equation. And now, they want reassurance. What kind of reassurance? Michael grabbed the paperwork off the table again. This kind. Finally. The truth. You need me to erase the debt records. They're family transfers, Mom. They were documented loans. Dad only did that for tax reasons. No, I said quietly. Your father did it because he believed responsibility matters. Michael's expression darkened immediately. Jesus Christ. Are we really doing this? After everything I'm carrying right now? I looked at him carefully. How bad is it? For the first time since arriving, genuine fear finally surfaced in his eyes. Not anger. Fear. If this financing falls apart, he admitted softly, I could lose everything. My heart broke a little hearing that, because beneath all the arrogance and cruelty, I suddenly saw my little boy again, terrified, drowning, desperate not to fail. And then he delivered the final blow. Lauren's pregnant. The room went silent. I stared at him. What? He nodded slowly. We found out 2 weeks ago. Emotion crashed through me instantly. A baby? My grandchild. For one beautiful second, pure joy tried to rise inside me. But Michael kept talking. We're trying to stabilize things before the baby comes. That's why I need you to sign. And just like that, the joy collapsed into pain. Even this moment, even this miracle, had become a negotiation. I looked down at the papers in my lap while tears burned behind my eyes. You came here to use your unborn child to pressure me. That's not fair. Isn't it? He looked exhausted now. Mom, please. I'm trying to protect my family. I lifted my eyes slowly to meet his. And what do you think your father and I spent our entire lives doing? That silenced him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, almost pleadingly, Michael said something that revealed the real truth underneath everything. You don't understand what happens if Edward pulls out now. Not if the bank refuses, not if the business struggles. If Edward pulls out, that was the leash around my son's neck. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Edward Whittaker wasn't helping Michael succeed. He was making sure Michael could never survive without him. After Michael left that evening, I sat alone in my living room for nearly an hour without turning on a single light. Snow drifted quietly outside the windows, while darkness settled around me like another layer of grief. Pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother. Under different circumstances, I would have cried from happiness. Miguel would have danced around the kitchen, pretending not to cry, while secretly crying harder than anyone. He used to dream about grandchildren constantly. Little Gonzales babies running around this house, he'd say with a grin. But now even that beautiful news felt tangled in manipulation and fear. I kept hearing Michael's voice in my head. I'm trying to protect my family, as if I weren't family anymore. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text message from him. Can you please look over the paperwork tonight? The bank timeline is tight. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done to me. Just pressure. I set the phone face down on the coffee table without responding. Then I finally turned on the lamp beside Miguel's old recliner and stared at the stack of documents Michael left behind. The papers were professionally prepared, clean, careful, designed to sound harmless. Simple acknowledgement forms, clarifications of informal family support, voluntary gift confirmations. The wording almost made me laugh, because buried beneath all the polished legal language was one simple truth. My son wanted me to erase the evidence that his parents helped build his entire life. I suddenly remembered a conversation Miguel and I had years earlier, shortly after Michael married Lauren. We were sitting on this exact couch after returning from a Whitaker charity gala where I spent 3 hours feeling invisible. Miguel loosened his tie and said quietly, Edward doesn't want Michael to feel equal. He wants Michael to feel grateful. At the time, I thought my husband was overreacting. Now I realized he saw the danger long before I did. The next morning, Angela returned to review the documents Michael brought over. She barely made it halfway through the first page before snorting in disbelief. Oh, this is slick. What does that mean? It means somebody paid expensive lawyers to make financial surrender sound polite. I rubbed my forehead tiredly. So, if I sign, you effectively weaken your legal protections significantly. I looked toward the window. And if I don't, Angela hesitated, then Michael probably loses whatever financing Edward promised him. Pain twisted sharply through my chest, because despite everything, I still didn't want my son destroyed. Angela seemed to read my thoughts immediately. Krista listened to me carefully, she said firmly. Protecting someone from consequences is not the same thing as loving them. I looked down silently. He humiliated you publicly, she continued, then came here demanding financial favors without remorse. That's not desperation alone. That's entitlement. The word stung because it was true. I hated that it was true. My phone rang again around noon. Michael, I answered slowly. Hello? His voice sounded impatient immediately. So what? The paperwork. I'm still reviewing it. A long exhale came through the phone. Mom, this isn't complicated. It feels complicated to me. You're making this harder than it needs to be. There it was again. My emotions, my pain, my hesitation, always an inconvenience. I spoke carefully. Michael, did you ever plan to tell Lauren's family that your father and I funded most of your house silence? Then finally, that's not relevant. It's relevant to me. Why I almost laughed from heartbreak. Because I mattered once, I wanted to say. Because your father worked himself sick to help you. Because you let another man sit in his place at Christmas. Instead, I asked quietly, does Edward even know Michael's tone sharpened instantly? Don't start this. That's not an answer. He knows enough. Enough. Not the truth, just enough. And suddenly, everything became painfully clear. Michael had spent years building a fake version of himself around the Whitakers. A self-made businessman. A rising success story. A man who belonged beside wealthy people. And now the truth threatened the entire illusion. You're ashamed of us, I whispered before I could stop myself. The silence afterward felt enormous. Finally, Michael spoke quieter this time. That's not fair. Isn't it? He stopped. What, you don't understand how they see people. I closed my eyes. No, Michael, I thought sadly. I understand perfectly. That was the problem. They look down on us, I said softly. That's not, they always have. He didn't deny it. That hurt more than anything else, because silence is confession sometimes. I need this deal, Mom, he said finally. You have no idea how much pressure I'm under. What exactly did Edward promise you? Another pause. Then reluctantly, a major expansion partnership. With whose money investors? What investors? You wouldn't know them. The dismissiveness in his voice snapped something inside me. Stop talking to me like I'm stupid. Silence. Then for the first time, Michael sounded slightly ashamed. I didn't mean, yes, you did. I stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen window while holding the phone. Outside, children were building snowmen across the street, while Christmas decorations still hung from rooftops. Ordinary families, ordinary love. I wondered what that felt like now. Your father used to work 18 hours a day, I said quietly. Do you remember that, Mom? He destroyed his back carrying drywall because he wanted you to have opportunities he never had? I know. Do you? My voice cracked slightly because the man sitting at that Christmas table acted embarrassed by where he came from. Michael's breathing grew heavier on the line. You think I wanted things to happen like that? You let them happen. That's easy for you to say. His sudden anger startled even him. You don't know what it's like trying to survive in those rooms. One wrong move, and people treat you like trash. The irony nearly took my breath away, because that was exactly what he'd done to me. I lowered myself slowly into a kitchen chair. And what do you think you did to me on Christmas silence? Long silence. For one tiny second, I thought maybe he finally understood. Then he ruined it. Can we please stay focused on the paperwork? I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because heartbreak sometimes reaches a point where laughter becomes the only thing keeping you from collapsing. You still don't get it, I whispered. Mom, no. Listen to me now. My voice surprised even myself. Calm, steady, strong. For years, I kept making excuses for you because I thought pressure was changing you. But pressure doesn't create character, Michael. It reveals it. He went quiet immediately. I raised you to protect people weaker than you, I continued softly. Not humiliate them to impress richer ones. You think this is about impressing Edward? I think you're terrified he'll stop approving of you. His breathing sharpened again. Then suddenly, quietly, he said something that revealed more truth than he intended. You have no idea what happens if he walks away now. Fear. Real fear. Not pride. Not arrogance. Fear. I closed my eyes slowly. Edward Whittaker wasn't helping my son. He owned him. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt something dangerous rising beneath my heartbreak. Anger. Not loud anger. Not revenge. Something colder. The kind that appears when a woman finally realizes kindness has been mistaken for weakness. Michael, I said quietly, I'm not signing anything right now. What I need time? You don't understand. No, I interrupted firmly. You don't understand. His voice hardened instantly. If this financing collapses, it affects my wife, my child, and whose fault is that? The silence that followed was different this time. Not guilty, hostile. When Michael finally spoke again, his voice sounded almost unfamiliar. You're being selfish. The word hit me hard. Selfish. After a lifetime of sacrifice, after years of financial help, after humiliation. Selfish. I felt tears sting my eyes again, but this time I refused to let him hear them. Quietly, steadily, I answered, no, Michael. I'm finally learning not to disappear for people who would never do the same for me. Then I hung up the phone. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself over my son. The silence after I hung up on Michael felt almost unreal. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at my phone in my trembling hand, hearing my own heartbeat pound inside my ears. I had never hung up on my son before. Not once in his entire life. Even during his worst teenage years, even during arguments after Miguel died, Even during moments when he ignored me for weeks, I had always stayed gentle, always stayed available, always stayed reachable. But something about hearing him call me selfish after everything I sacrificed finally broke through the fog I'd been living in for years. I slowly placed the phone down on the kitchen table and covered my face with both hands. Then I cried. Not because I regretted what I said, because I knew there was no going back anymore. The version of me who accepted crumbs just to stay connected to her child had finally disappeared, and grief followed her out the door. That evening, Angela came by again carrying takeout containers and a bottle of wine. The second she saw my face, she sighed softly. "He called again, didn't he?" I nodded. "He said I'm selfish." Angela closed her eyes briefly, like she was physically restraining herself from saying something dangerous. "Of course he did." I hung up on him. At that, she actually smiled a little. "Good." I stared at her weakly. "It doesn't feel good." "No," she admitted gently. "Boundaries rarely do at first." We ate quietly at the kitchen table while snow fell steadily outside. After a while, Angela set down her fork and looked at me carefully. "What are you most afraid of right now?" The answer came instantly. That he'll hate me. Her expression softened immediately. "Oh, Krista, I know how pathetic that sounds." "It doesn't sound pathetic. It sounds like motherhood." Tears burned behind my eyes again. "I keep thinking about the baby," I whispered. "What if this destroys everything before my grandchild is even born?" Angela reached for my hand. "You didn't create this situation." "But I could fix it." With a signature, I looked away silently. Angela leaned back slowly. "Let me ask you something. If Miguel were sitting here right now, what would he tell you to do?" The answer hit me before I could stop it. He'd tell me to stop rescuing Michael from consequences. Exactly. I closed my eyes, because that was the truth I'd been avoiding. Miguel loved our son fiercely, but he never confused love with surrender. I did. The next morning, things got worse. I woke up to 6 missed calls from Michael and 3 text messages. "Please answer. Edward's people need confirmation today. Mom, stop doing this." That last message sat in my chest like a stone. Stop doing this, as if I created the situation, as if I pushed myself away from the Christmas table, as if I forced him into debt and dependency. I didn't answer. Around noon, my church friend Linda called. At first, her voice sounded hesitant. "Krista, honey, are you all right?" Something in her tone immediately put me on edge. "Yes." "Why?" A pause. Then carefully, I saw Lauren's Facebook post. My stomach dropped. "What post?" Linda hesitated again. "She didn't mention your name directly, but people know who she means." Cold dread spread slowly through my body. After we hung up, I opened Facebook for the first time in weeks. And there it was. A long, emotional post from Lauren about toxic family members who weaponize money against young families during the holidays. My hands started shaking immediately. She wrote about certain people trying to sabotage Michael's future over old gifts freely given with love. Then came the line that nearly made me physically sick. Some mothers would rather control their sons than see them build independent lives. Hundreds of comments filled the post. "Praying for you both. So sad when parents become manipulative. Protect your peace. Toxic mothers hate losing control." I stared at the screen in complete disbelief. These people didn't know me. They didn't know Miguel. They didn't know the sacrifices behind those documents. But suddenly, I had become the villain in a story carefully designed to destroy me. My chest tightened so badly I had to sit down. Then another comment caught my eye. Patricia Whitaker had replied publicly. "Some people confuse sacrifice with ownership." That one shattered me, because it revealed exactly how they saw us. Not loving parents, not family, just embarrassing working class people clinging to relevance through money. I shut the phone off completely after that. For nearly an hour, I sat motionless in my living room while humiliation burned through me all over again. First Christmas dinner. Now this. I suddenly understood something terrifying. Lauren and the Whitakers weren't trying to solve a financial problem anymore. They were trying to pressure me socially, emotionally, publicly, and worst of all, Michael was allowing it. Around 3 that afternoon, Angela showed up unannounced again. The second she walked in and saw my face, she knew. What did they do? I handed her my phone silently. She read the post once, then again, then her expression turned cold, in a way I'd never seen before. Oh, absolutely not. I sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch. I feel sick. You should feel angry. I feel humiliated. Angela sat beside me. Krista, listen carefully to me right now. Public manipulation only works when the victim stays ashamed. I looked at her weakly. I don't want a war. You're already in one. That silenced me. Because she was right. The war had started the moment Michael decided his mother's dignity was negotiable. Angela kept scrolling through the comments with growing disbelief. Look at this, she muttered. They're building a narrative. What does that mean? It means they're preparing to discredit you emotionally before this financial situation escalates. Fear crawled up my spine. You think this could become legal? I think Edward Whittaker plans ahead. That terrified me, because Miguel used to say the same thing. I suddenly remembered something else from Christmas dinner. The way Lauren held her phone during parts of my conversation with Michael near the hallway. A terrible thought hit me instantly. She recorded me. Angela looked up sharply. What? At Christmas. And maybe during Michael's visit, too. Angela's expression darkened immediately. Did you say anything threatening? No. Anything unstable? No. Then let them record. I looked at her uncertainly. What if they twist things they already are? That was true. And somehow hearing it aloud made something inside me harden slightly. Not bitterness. Clarity. For the first time in weeks, I stopped asking how to make everyone love me again. Instead, I asked a different question. Why am I begging for dignity from people determined to strip it away? Angela squeezed my hand again. You know what scares controlling people most? What? When the person they underestimated finally stops apologizing. I looked down at my wedding ring, still resting on my finger after all these years. Miguel used to kiss this hand after every argument and say, You are stronger than you think, mi corazón. Maybe he knew someday I'd need to hear that after he was gone. Just then my phone buzzed again. Michael. This time, instead of panic, I felt tired, deeply tired. I answered slowly. What? His voice sounded furious immediately. Why are you ignoring Lauren's messages? I blinked in disbelief. Not Mom. Are you okay? Not. This got out of hand. No. Why are you ignoring Lauren? I closed my eyes, and for the very first time in my life, I realized something heartbreaking. My son wasn't calling as my child anymore. He was calling as Edward Whittaker's representative. I held the phone against my ear while Michael waited impatiently for an answer. Outside my living room window, the snow had finally stopped falling, but the sky remained heavy and gray over Albuquerque. Everything felt cold lately, even my own son's voice. Well, he snapped. Why are you ignoring Lauren? I stared ahead blankly. Because she publicly humiliated me, I thought. Because she turned strangers against me. Because your wife decided my pain was a public relations problem. But somehow the words came out calmer than I expected. She lied about me online. Michael exhaled sharply. She didn't name you. Oh, please. She's upset. So am I. That's different. The sentence landed so fast I almost missed it. Different. Lauren's feelings deserve protection. Mine deserved management. I leaned back slowly against the couch. How exactly is it different? Michael silenced. Then came the answer that told me everything. You know how emotional she gets. I closed my eyes. There it was again. Women like Lauren were emotional. Women like me were inconvenient. She's pregnant, he continued. Stress isn't good for her right now. A bitter ache spread through my chest. I already loved that unborn child fiercely. And somehow they kept using that baby like a shield against accountability. Quietly, I asked, "Do you think stress has been good for me?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "You're stronger than Lauren." That nearly broke my heart, because children often hurt the strongest parent the most, precisely because they assume they'll survive it. I spoke slowly. "Strong people still bleed, Michael." The silence afterwards stretched painfully long. Then his tone hardened again. "Look, can you just call Lauren and smooth this over?" Smooth this over, like I was cleaning up a spilled drink instead of mourning the collapse of my family. "I'm not apologizing for protecting myself. You're blowing this completely out of proportion." I laughed softly in disbelief. "You pushed me away from the Christmas table. Oh my God, not this again." The exhaustion in his voice stunned me. Not guilt, exhaustion. Like my pain had become repetitive background noise. Something inside me went quiet then. Not sadness, not anger. Something colder. The final death of denial. "I need some space from both of you right now," I said calmly. Immediately, his tone sharpened. "So that's it. You're just abandoning us." The accusation hit me so hard I almost dropped the phone. Abandoning. After a lifetime of sacrifice, after helping fund his business, his home, his future. I whispered, "You abandoned me long before I stepped away." Then I hung up. This time I didn't cry afterward. That scared me more than the tears ever had, because grief at least still feels connected to love. But numbness? Numbness feels like something ending. The next few days became unbearable. Lauren's post spread farther than I realized. At church the following Sunday, conversations stopped when I walked into the fellowship hall. Women who once hugged me warmly suddenly smiled too carefully. A man from Bible study awkwardly patted my shoulder and said, "Family conflict can really make people bitter at our age." At our age. As if aging itself had turned me cruel. I smiled politely while humiliation burned through my body. Then came the worst moment of all. Linda approached me near the coffee table with visible discomfort. "Krista, I probably shouldn't mention this." My stomach tightened immediately. "What?" She hesitated. "Well, Lauren told some people you're threatening Michael financially because you don't approve of their lifestyle." I stared at her. Threatening. The word echoed inside my skull like a slap. What exactly did she say? Linda looked embarrassed. "She implied you're trying to force control over their marriage because you don't want Michael depending on her family." For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. Not because strangers believed it, because Michael was allowing it, maybe even helping it. I left church early that morning before anyone could see me cry. Back home, I sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. The loneliness felt physical now, like pressure crushing inward from all sides. I suddenly understood why so many older women disappear quietly into isolation after family betrayal. Because eventually, humiliation becomes exhausting. You stop defending yourself simply because you're tired. When I finally entered the house, Angela was already there waiting on my porch. One look at my face and she stood immediately. "What happened?" I tried answering calmly. Instead, I burst into tears. Angela wrapped both arms around me while I cried against her shoulder like a child. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered. "I can't survive being hated by my own son." "You are not hated. It feels like it." She guided me inside carefully. After making tea, Angela sat across from me at the kitchen table while I explained everything from church. The entire time, her expression grew colder and colder. "This is intentional," she said finally. "What is the social isolation?" I frowned weakly. "What do you mean?" Angela folded her hands carefully. "Edward Whittaker understands power, and one of the oldest forms of power is controlling public perception." I stared at her silently. "They want you ashamed," she continued. "Ashamed people become easier to pressure." My chest tightened. Pressure into what signing? Of course, everything came back to the documents, the loans, The financial dependency. I rub my forehead tiredly. I don't even recognize my own life anymore. Angela softened slightly. That's because this stopped being about family weeks ago. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. I didn't want to show you this until I verified everything. Fear crawled slowly into my stomach. What is it? A former employee from one of Edward's development companies contacted me. I blinked in confusion. What he saw Lauren's post online? Apparently, Edward has a reputation. Angela opened the folder carefully. Inside were printed emails, corporate filings, and handwritten notes. Krista, she said quietly, Edward Whitaker's business empire isn't as stable as it looks. I stared down at the papers. What are you saying? I'm saying several of his recent commercial projects are drowning in debt. A chill ran through me. Angela slid another document toward me. And according to this former employee, Edward's been aggressively shifting liability away from himself. I frowned. How? Through partnerships. Suddenly, my blood went cold. Michael. Angela nodded grimly. I think your son isn't just receiving investment help. He's being positioned. For what she hesitated carefully before answering. To absorb risk if things collapse. The room tilted slightly around me. No. I hope I'm wrong. But she didn't sound wrong. Not even a little. Memories suddenly rearranged themselves inside my head. Michael's constant panic. Edward's pressure. The desperate need to erase debt records. The fear. Dear God. They're setting him up, I whispered. Angela looked at me sadly. I think they already have. For several seconds I couldn't speak, because beneath all my anger, all my humiliation, all my heartbreak, he was still my little boy, manipulated, weak, lost, but still mine. Tears filled my eyes again. I don't know how to save him anymore. Angela's expression softened deeply. Maybe saving him doesn't mean rescuing him this time. I looked at her helplessly. Then what does it mean? Before she could answer, my phone buzzed again across the table. This time, it wasn't Michael. It was Lauren. And the message made my entire body go cold. If you don't cooperate soon, things are going to get very ugly for everyone. Angela slowly held out her hand for the phone. I gave it to her silently. She read the message once, then looked up at me very carefully. Well, she said quietly, now we know exactly who we're dealing with. I barely touched my dinner that night. The message from Lauren kept replaying in my head over and over again. If you don't cooperate soon, things are going to get very ugly for everyone. Not emotional, not impulsive, calculated. The kind of sentence written by someone used to getting compliance through intimidation. Angela stayed late that evening, reviewing the documents from Edward Whitaker's former employee, while I sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch, trying to process everything. At some point, she removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Krista, I need you to prepare yourself emotionally for something. Fear tightened instantly inside my chest. What? She hesitated carefully. I think Michael may already be legally exposed. I stared at her blankly. What does that mean? Angela stood and carried several documents to the coffee table. These development partnerships Edward pushed Michael into, she explained. Some of them were structured through shell LLCs. I frowned. I don't understand. It means the liability trail becomes complicated, messy, sometimes intentionally. Cold dread crawled slowly up my spine, and Michael signed these looks like it. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. Oh my God. Angela sat beside me again. I don't think your son fully understood what he was agreeing to, but Edward did. Yes. Silence filled the room heavily. The Christmas lights on my tree blinked softly in the corner, while my entire understanding of Michael's life began shifting beneath my feet. For weeks, I'd been focused on the humiliation, the betrayal, the cruelty. But now another truth emerged underneath all of it. Michael wasn't acting like a man in control. He was acting like a trapped man pretending to be powerful. And suddenly, I remembered dozens of little moments I'd ignored over the past 2 years. Michael answering Edward's calls immediately, no matter the hour. Michael constantly anxious before Whitaker family events. Michael snapping defensively anytime finances came up. The exhaustion behind his eyes at Christmas dinner. Dear God. He wasn't becoming Edward Whitaker. He was being consumed by him. Still, none of that erased what he'd done to me. That was the painful contradiction tearing me apart inside. A mother can recognize her child's suffering and still bleed from the wounds they caused her. Around 10 o'clock that night, Angela's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It's the former employee. She stepped into the kitchen to answer privately while I remained frozen on the couch. Several minutes later, she returned looking more serious than before. "What is it?" I whispered. Angela sat down slowly. He confirmed something. Fear tightened in my throat. What Edwards Company is under quiet federal review related to investor disclosures. My stomach dropped. Federal she nodded grimly. Nothing public yet, but apparently several projects are massively over-leveraged. I struggled to process the words, and Angela looked directly at me. Your son's name appears on multiple partnership agreements. For a moment, the room actually spun. I grabbed the arm of the couch to steady myself. No. Angela's voice softened immediately. Krista. He could go to prison, I'm not saying that, but it's possible. She hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Tears filled my eyes instantly. Not because Michael was innocent, not because he hadn't hurt me, because suddenly I saw the entire nightmare clearly. Edward Whitaker hadn't merely manipulated my son emotionally. He had built a cage around him financially, and Michael was so desperate for approval, he walked into it willingly. I started crying quietly. Angela moved beside me immediately. Hey, he's still my baby, I whispered through tears. No matter what he's done, he's still my baby. I know. I don't know how to stop loving him. You don't have to. That sentence settled deeply inside me. Love wasn't the problem. Surrender was. The next morning, I woke up to someone pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding. My heart jumped violently as I hurried down the hallway. Through the window, I saw Michael standing outside. The second I opened the door, he stormed inside. What the hell is going on? I blinked in shock. What? Why is Angela Ruiz investigating Edward? Cold realization hit me instantly. Edward was watching. Of course he was. Michael paced angrily across my living room, while snow melted off his expensive shoes onto my hardwood floor. You hired a lawyer against us. I stared at him. Do you hear yourself? You're turning this into some kind of war? No, I said quietly. Your wife and her family did that when they threatened me publicly. Michael dragged both hands through his hair in frustration. You don't understand what you're messing with. The fear in his voice chilled me. Not arrogance, fear. Real fear. Then explain it to me, I demanded. He stopped pacing instantly. Silence. Then finally, it's complicated. I almost laughed. Complicated seems to be your favorite word lately. Michael looked exhausted now. Older somehow. I'm trying to fix things. By destroying me? That's not fair. No. My voice finally rose. You let your wife humiliate me online. You let strangers believe I'm some controlling monster. And now you're angry because I finally stopped protecting people who keep hurting me. His jaw tightened. You're making everything worse. Worse than being pushed away from my own family table on Christmas. Oh my God, not the chair again. The explosion startled both of us. For several seconds, silence crashed between us. Then quietly, painfully, I said, it was never about the chair. Michael froze. Tears burned behind my eyes again. It was about realizing my son cared more about impressing another man than protecting his own mother. His face changed instantly. Not angry anymore, cornered. I took a shaky breath. Your father spent his entire life building you up, and you let Edward Whitaker sit in his place like he mattered more. That's not what happened. Then what happened? Michael opened his mouth, closed it, because there was no answer. Finally, he looked away and muttered, "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." There it was again. Pressure. As if pressure explained cruelty. I stepped closer slowly. "What exactly is Edward threatening you with?" Michael's eyes snapped toward mine immediately. Too fast. Too defensive. And suddenly I knew. "He is threatening you," I whispered. Silence. Oh God. I watched my grown son crumble slightly right in front of me. "He says if this refinancing collapses, investors will panic," Michael admitted quietly. "Everything could implode." What does that mean? It means lawsuits, debt exposure, bankruptcy. And whose fault is that Michael looked genuinely miserable now? I didn't know how bad things were when I signed everything. My chest tightened painfully. "What did you sign?" "Partnership guarantees. Development liabilities." Fear spread through me like ice water. "Michael, I thought it was temporary leverage. Edward said everybody structures deals this way." Of course he did. Manipulators always normalize danger before springing the trap. I suddenly remembered Miguel warning me years earlier. A desperate man will trust anyone who makes him feel important. Michael sank onto the couch and covered his face with both hands. For the first time in months, he didn't look arrogant. He looked terrified. And heartbreak flooded through me all over again. Because underneath the expensive clothes and cruel behavior, I could still see my little boy drowning. Quietly, I sat across from him. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" He laughed bitterly into his hands. "Because you and Dad always looked at me like I could do better than this." The words hit me hard. What Michael finally lifted his head. "You have any idea what it feels like being 41 years old and still feeling like you're failing?" he whispered. Edward made me feel like I could finally become somebody. Tears filled my eyes instantly. Oh, Michael. He respected power, success, confidence. "No," I said softly. "He respected usefulness." That silenced him completely. And deep down, I think he knew I was right. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then finally, quietly, my son asked the question that revealed just how trapped he truly was. "What happens if I can't fix this?" I looked at him for a very long time before answering. And for the first time since Christmas began, I told him the truth instead of protecting his feelings. "You may lose everything." Michael stared at me from across the living room like he no longer recognized the woman sitting in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Because for most of his life, I softened every truth to protect him. Not anymore. "You may lose everything." The words stayed suspended heavily between us. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows, while the Christmas tree lights blinked in silence nearby. Michael rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "You think I don't already know that?" I looked at him carefully. "No," I answered honestly. "I think you've been trying very hard not to know it." That hit him harder than yelling ever could. His shoulders sagged slightly. For a moment he looked exhausted beyond words. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down immediately. Edward. Even from several feet away, I saw the name flash across the screen. Michael's entire posture changed at once. Tension, fear, obedience. He rejected the call quickly, but 30 seconds later, another message appeared. Then another. I watched silently while my son's breathing became shallow. "He tracks you like an employee?" I said quietly. Michael snapped instantly. "You don't understand how high-level business works." "No," I replied softly. "I understand how control works." That shut him up again. Finally, he stood. "I have to go." "Of course you do." He looked wounded by the comment. Good. Maybe for once he should feel wounded too. At the front door, he paused awkwardly. For 1 second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he asked quietly, "Are you really working with Angela against Edward?" "Against Edward. Still not against me. Not against your mother." Edward remained the center of gravity in his mind. "I'm protecting myself," I answered. Michael's jaw tightened again. "If you push too hard, this could destroy everything." I stepped closer slowly. Michael, your life is already on fire. I'm just the first person refusing to pretend it isn't. He looked away immediately. Then, without another word, he walked out into the cold. That evening, Angela called with news that made my stomach twist. Edward wants a meeting. I froze. What kind of meeting? A family dinner. I almost laughed from disbelief. Another one. Apparently, he wants to clear the air. The phrase itself sounded threatening. One Saturday night, and you think I should go? Angela was quiet for a moment. Yes. Fear crawled slowly through me. Why? Because I think Edward believes you're still emotionally weak enough to pressure publicly. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, and if he's wrong, Angela's voice became very calm. Then Saturday will be the first time he realizes you're not afraid of him anymore. Saturday arrived colder than the rest of the week. The entire drive to Santa Fe, my stomach stayed in knots. Angela drove separately behind me because she insisted on attending as my attorney informally. When we pulled into Michael's driveway, I immediately noticed something strange. No Christmas decorations remained outside the house anymore. Everything looked sterile, tense, like joy itself had evacuated the property. Angela turned off her engine and looked toward me seriously. Whatever happens tonight, stay calm. I'm trying. No, she corrected gently. I mean truly calm. Men like Edward lose power when women stop reacting emotionally. I nodded slowly, but deep down, I still felt terrified. Not of Edward, of what I might discover about my son. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt suffocating immediately. Lauren greeted us at the door, looking pale and anxious. Gone was the polished confidence from Christmas dinner. Krista, she said carefully. I noticed she didn't hug me. Good. I didn't want fake affection anymore. Michael stood near the fireplace, already holding a whiskey glass. The second our eyes met, guilt flickered across his face, then disappeared. Edward emerged from the dining room, smiling like a politician. Krista, he boomed warmly. I'm glad you came. The performance almost impressed me. Almost. Patricia sat silently nearby with the same judgmental expression she always wore around me. Then Edward noticed Angela. His smile tightened immediately. And who is this? Angela stepped forward calmly. Angela Ruiz? Family counsel. The room changed instantly. Michael stiffened. Lauren looked frightened. And for the very first time since Christmas, Edward Whitaker stopped looking amused. Interesting. Dinner itself felt unbearable. Nobody touched their food much. Conversations stumbled awkwardly between forced politeness and invisible hostility. Finally, Edward set down his wine glass. Well, he sighed dramatically, I think we should discuss why we're really here. There it is, I thought. He folded his hands calmly. Krista, I believe unfortunate misunderstandings have escalated tensions unnecessarily. Misunderstandings? I almost smiled. You mean humiliating me publicly and threatening me online? Lauren flinched visibly. Edward ignored the comment smoothly. Emotions can distort perception. Angela spoke before I could answer. Financial coercion tends to clarify perception quite effectively. Edward's eyes shifted toward her coldly. I wasn't speaking to you. Angela smiled slightly. That's unfortunate, because legally speaking, you may need to. The silence that followed became razor sharp. Michael looked physically ill. Edward slowly leaned back in his chair. Let's stop pretending this is about emotions, he said finally. This is about paperwork. There it was. The truth stripped bare. Not family healing, not reconciliation. Documents, money, control. I reached calmly into my purse and placed several folders onto the table. Edward's expression changed immediately. What's this? Records? I answered softly. Michael stared at the folders in horror. He recognized them instantly. Angela opened one carefully. Signed loan acknowledgments, property-linked financial transfers, equity protection structures. Patricia's face lost color. Edward remained still. Too still. Dangerously still. Michael looked at me in disbelief. You brought everything. I held his gaze steadily. Your father kept excellent records. Edward finally spoke again, but his voice sounded different now. Harder. These documents are old family matters. No, Angela corrected calmly. They're active legal interests. Michael rubbed both hands through his hair in panic. Mom? I looked at my son carefully. This is what you wanted erased, isn't it? He couldn't answer, because everyone finally understood the truth. The successful businessman image Edward helped create rested partly on money Michael never truly owned. Edward's voice sharpened suddenly. You're making a mistake, Krista. For the first time since meeting him years ago, I wasn't intimidated. Maybe grief burned fear out of people eventually, or maybe humiliation finally teaches older women they have nothing left to lose. Quietly, I asked, what kind of mistake? His eyes locked onto mine. If these documents become obstacles, investors may reconsider their confidence in Michael entirely. Translation. Your son's life collapses if you resist me, Angela answered before I could. Interesting wording. Edward ignored her. Then slowly, carefully, he delivered the sentence that changed everything. You have to decide whether protecting your pride matters more than protecting your son. The room went completely silent, and suddenly, I understood the entire game. Edward never believed mothers protected themselves. He believed mothers sacrificed endlessly. He believed guilt would force me back into submission. The terrifying thing was, until recently, he would have been right. I looked directly at him across that polished dining table and spoke more calmly than I felt. You made one mistake, Edward. He frowned slightly. You thought humiliating me would make me weaker. For the first time all night, Edward Whitaker looked uncertain, and beside him, Michael slowly lowered his eyes in shame. Because deep down, he finally realized something too. The mother he pushed away at Christmas was no longer begging for a seat at anyone's table. The silence after my words settled over the dining room like smoke after an explosion. Edward Whitaker stared at me across the table, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something crack behind his polished confidence. Not fear, exactly, but irritation. The irritation powerful men feel when someone they dismissed suddenly refuses to stay small. Michael looked frozen beside him. Lauren sat rigid in her chair, one trembling hand resting unconsciously over her stomach. And Patricia Whitaker kept glancing nervously between her husband and Angela. Interesting, I thought. So even Patricia was afraid of him. Edward recovered first. Of course he did. Men like him spent their entire lives practicing control. He leaned back slowly in his chair and gave a small, humorless smile. You're emotional right now, Krista. I almost laughed. That word again. Emotional. As if women became irrational the moment they stopped surrendering. No, I said calmly. I'm awake. His smile vanished instantly. Angela remained quiet beside me, watching carefully. Edward folded his hands together. Let's be practical. Michael's company is vulnerable. The market shifted unexpectedly. We're trying to stabilize things before unnecessary panic spreads. Interesting. Not Michael's company, not Michael's decisions. We. I looked directly at my son. Is that how you see this, too? Michael opened his mouth, closed it again. Edward answered for him. Michael understands the stakes. No, I said quietly. I asked my son. That visibly irritated Edward. Michael rubbed both hands together anxiously. Mom, this situation got bigger than I expected. Finally. A tiny piece of honesty. I held his gaze. How much bigger? Michael hesitated. Then Edward interrupted sharply. We're not discussing confidential business structures. Angela finally spoke again. That's convenient. Edward's eyes flashed toward her. I'm warning you carefully, Ms. Ruiz. Interference could expose everyone at this table to consequences. There it was. The threat. Not even subtle anymore. Lauren visibly flinched. Michael looked sick. And suddenly, something clicked inside my mind. Edward wasn't confident tonight. He was desperate. I turned slowly toward Michael. Do you know what your father used to say about desperate people? Michael avoided my eyes. No. He said desperation makes dangerous men show their true character. Edward laughed suddenly, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, please. Spare us the working class wisdom speeches. The insult landed exactly the way he intended. For years, comments like that would have embarrassed me. Tonight, they only revealed him. I smiled faintly. You've spent years trying to make Michael ashamed of where he came from. Edward's expression hardened immediately. I encouraged him to elevate himself. You encouraged him to believe love had to be earned through money. Michael stood abruptly. Stop it. The pain in his voice silenced the room instantly. He looked exhausted, cornered. I can't do this tonight. Edward's tone sharpened immediately. Sit down, Michael. Not a request, an order. And to my horror, my 41-year-old son almost obeyed automatically. He actually started lowering himself back into the chair before catching himself halfway. The realization hit him too. I saw it in his face. For one terrible second, Michael looked like a man waking up inside his own prison. Edward noticed it immediately. Control slipping. Dangerous. You need to calm down, Edward said more carefully now. Everyone here is trying to help you. Then Michael finally looked directly at him. No, he whispered. You're trying to protect yourself. The room went dead silent. Edward's face changed instantly. Not polite anymore. Not controlled. Cold. Very cold. You should think carefully before repeating accusations you don't fully understand. Michael laughed weakly, except there was no humor in it. That's the problem, he said quietly. I'm finally starting to understand. Lauren looked terrified now. Michael. But he kept staring at Edward. All those partnership agreements, he continued. The liability transfers, the refinancing structures. Edward's voice became dangerously calm. This is neither the time nor place. Michael ignored him. You told me everybody structures investments this way. They do. Then why are your attorneys suddenly trying to isolate exposure? Angela and I exchanged a quick glance, so Michael knew more than he'd admitted. Edward leaned forward slowly. Because weak investors panic during market corrections. No, Michael whispered. Because you knew things were collapsing. There it was. The truth finally spoken aloud. Patricia gasped softly. Lauren covered her mouth with trembling fingers. And Edward Whitaker stopped pretending completely. His entire face hardened into something sharp and ugly. I built everything you have, he said coldly. Michael stared at him. No, I answered quietly before my son could speak. Miguel and I built the foundation. You just exploited his insecurity afterward. Edward slammed his wine glass down so hard, red wine splashed across the tablecloth. You have no idea how the real world works. I looked directly into his eyes. No, I know exactly how men like you work. The room felt electrically tense now. Years of manipulation were finally surfacing all at once. Edward stood slowly from his chair. You think your son succeeds without me? Michael looked shattered. And suddenly, Edward delivered the sentence that revealed everything. He needed me because he never believed he was enough on his own. The cruelty of it stunned even me, not because it was entirely false, because it was strategically true. That's how manipulators trap people. They locate your deepest wound, then convince you only they can heal it. Michael's face crumpled slightly. For the first time all night, I saw my little boy again beneath the expensive clothes and damaged pride. A child desperate to feel worthy. And Edward knew exactly how to feed that hunger. Lauren suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking. Dad, stop. Edward barely looked at her. No, your husband needs reality. Then he pointed directly at Michael. You wanted to sit at important tables. This is the price. Price. The word echoed painfully through the room. I thought about Christmas dinner instantly. The chair. The humiliation. The desperate performance Michael put on to please this man. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. Michael didn't push me away because he stopped loving me. He pushed me away because he believed Edward's approval mattered more than his own dignity. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly. Not from weakness, from grief, because no mother wants to watch her child sell pieces of his soul just to feel accepted. Michael finally spoke again, but his voice sounded broken now. You were going to let me take the fall. Edward's silence answered him, and that silence destroyed whatever illusion remained. Lauren burst into tears instantly. Oh my God. Patricia stood abruptly. Edward, but he snapped at her too. Sit down. That one command told me everything about their marriage. Fear, control, submission. Angela leaned forward calmly. Federal investigators tend to respond poorly to liability laundering schemes. Edward turned toward her slowly. You have no proof. Angela gave him a small smile. We have enough? For the first time that entire evening, Edward Whitaker looked genuinely worried. Just for a second. But I saw it. So did Michael. And I think that was the moment my son finally realized the truth. The powerful man he worshipped wasn't invincible. He was scared too. Michael sank slowly back into his chair, staring blankly at the table. Years of illusion collapsing in real time. Quietly, I stood up. Everyone looked toward me. I picked up my purse calmly. I think I've heard enough for one night. Michael looked up immediately. Mom? The word sounded different this time. Smaller. Human. But I wasn't ready to comfort him yet. Not after everything. I looked at my son carefully. You spent years trying to earn a seat at someone else's table, I said softly. And in the process, you forgot the people who built one for you first. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Good. Maybe pain was finally reaching the right places. Then I turned toward Edward one last time. You made a terrible mistake. He frowned slightly. You assumed mothers become weak when they age. I stepped closer. But some women become dangerous the moment they stop being afraid of losing people who never truly valued them. And for the very first time, Edward Whitaker looked directly at me, not as a poor widow, but as a threat. The drive home from Santa Fe felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not relieved. Just emptied out. Angela followed behind me most of the way back to Albuquerque, before finally taking a different exit toward her neighborhood. Before turning away, she called through the open window at a stoplight. Don't answer any calls tonight. I nodded weakly. Then she added something softer. You did good, Krista. Good. The word felt foreign. For weeks, I'd felt like a terrible mother, a selfish woman, a bitter old widow ruining her son's future. But tonight, for the first time, I realized something important. Protecting yourself from people hurting you is not cruelty, even when those people are family, especially when those people are family. When I finally got home, exhaustion hit me all at once. I didn't even bother turning on most of the lights. I just sat in Miguel's recliner, staring at the dark living room, while memories drifted through my head like ghosts. Michael, at 5 years old, falling asleep against my chest after thunderstorms. Michael, at 14, crying because he thought he'd disappointed his father after losing a football game. Michael, at 27, promising he'd never forget where he came from. That promise hurt the most now. Around midnight, my phone started ringing. Michael. Again and again. Then texts. Mom, please answer. Please. I'm sorry. The last message made tears sting my eyes instantly. Not because everything was magically fixed, but because for the first time in weeks, my son sounded human again. I still didn't answer. Some wounds need silence before healing can even begin. The next morning, I found Michael sitting on my porch. My heart nearly stopped. He looked awful. Dark circles beneath his eyes, wrinkled clothes, exhaustion carved into every part of him. For a brief second, he reminded me painfully of Miguel during the final months of chemo. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying too much fear alone. When he saw me open the door, he stood immediately. Mom. His voice cracked. And suddenly, I knew. Something had changed after I left dinner. I stepped aside silently so he could come in. This time, unlike every recent visit, Michael didn't walk around like he owned the space. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man entering sacred ground after betraying it. Neither of us spoke for a while. I made coffee automatically, while he stood awkwardly in the kitchen staring at the floor. Finally, he whispered Lauren left for her mother's house. I looked up sharply. What she needed space. Pain flickered across his face. She's scared. Of Edward. Michael nodded slowly. That alone told me how bad things had become. I handed him a coffee mug quietly. Our fingers brushed for half a second, and suddenly tears filled his eyes. That nearly destroyed me. Because no matter how much someone hurts you, watching your child break apart still hurts worse. Michael sat heavily at the kitchen table. Then finally, after weeks of arrogance and excuses, my son shattered. I screwed everything up, he whispered. The rawness in his voice made my chest ache instantly. He covered his face with both hands and started crying. Not polite tears, not controlled emotion, real crying. The kind that comes from finally losing the energy to pretend. And suddenly I wasn't looking at a businessman anymore. I was looking at my little boy drowning inside a man's body. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he choked out. I swear to God, Mom. I sat down across from him slowly. Then tell me what happened. For several minutes, he couldn't even speak properly. Then the truth finally started pouring out. After marrying Lauren, Michael became obsessed with proving himself to Edward. At first, it was small things, buying more expensive clothes, moving into wealthier social circles, taking bigger business risks. Then Edward began advising him financially. You're too cautious. You think too small. You'll never grow without leverage. Michael admitted hearing those words from a powerful, wealthy man felt intoxicating at first, especially because deep down, he'd always felt inferior around the Whitakers. I hated how they looked at us, he whispered. Us. The word hurt. But at least he finally said it. Like we were less. I stayed silent. Because he wasn't wrong. Edward absolutely believed that. Michael wiped his eyes roughly. I kept thinking if I succeeded enough, they'd finally respect me. But they never did. His face crumpled again. No. That single word carried years of exhaustion inside it. The saddest part, I think my son genuinely believed wealth would finally buy him belonging. Instead, it only bought dependency. Michael stared into his untouched coffee. The business started struggling last year. Commercial projects slowed down, payroll got tighter, investors got nervous, and Edward stepped in. He nodded weakly. At first, he really did help. Then every favor became leverage. There it was. Exactly what Miguel predicted. Michael finally looked directly at me. I didn't realize how trapped I was until recently. Until the refinancing. His eyes widened slightly. How did you know that? Because your father knew men like Edward exist? Tears filled Michael's eyes again immediately. Dad warned me too? That shocked me. What Michael laughed bitterly through tears. He told me once, never let rich people convince you they own your dignity. I closed my eyes as grief punched through my chest all over again. That sounded exactly like Miguel. And I ignored him, Michael whispered. Silence settled heavily between us. Then finally, shakily, he said the words I'd been waiting weeks to hear. I'm sorry. My breath caught. Michael's face twisted painfully. I'm sorry for Christmas. I'm sorry for the chair. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small, just because I felt small around them. Tears slipped down my face silently, because this apology felt different. Not strategic, not pressured, real. I hated myself after you left that night, he whispered. But I kept doubling down because admitting I was wrong felt impossible. I nodded slowly. That too sounded true. Michael took a shaky breath. When you stood up to Edward last night, he laughed weakly again. It was the first time I realized how cowardly I'd become. The honesty in that sentence nearly broke me, but pain still remained underneath everything. Deep pain. I loved you enough to work 2 jobs for years, I said quietly, and you treated me like I was embarrassing. Michael started crying harder instantly. I know. No, I whispered. I don't think you fully do yet. That silenced him immediately. I looked at my son carefully. I can forgive mistakes, but humiliation leaves scars. He nodded slowly through tears. I know. And forgiveness doesn't mean pretending none of this happened. I know. For a long moment, we simply sat there crying quietly across the kitchen table while morning sunlight slowly filled the room. Then Michael finally whispered something that terrified me. Federal investigators contacted one of Edward's companies this morning. Fear tightened instantly inside me. What happens now? Michael looked utterly exhausted. I think Edward's going to try protecting himself, no matter who gets destroyed. That sounded exactly right. Then he reached shakily into his jacket pocket and pulled out several folded documents. I brought copies, he whispered. I frowned. Copies of what Michael swallowed hard. The agreements Edward had me sign. My heart started pounding immediately. Why are you giving these to me? He looked directly into my eyes. Because for the first time in months, I finally know which side I should have been on all along. And sitting there across from my broken son, I realized something painful, but true. The little boy I thought I lost forever might still be somewhere inside him after all. The next 3 months changed all our lives. Slowly at first, then all at once. Angela spent days reviewing the documents Michael brought from Edward's office. Every folder revealed another layer of financial manipulation. Hidden liabilities, misleading partnership structures, debt transfers buried beneath complicated legal language, and Michael's signature appeared everywhere. At first, every new discovery terrified me. I barely slept. Some nights, I would sit awake in Miguel's recliner until sunrise, staring at the dark window, while fear crawled through my chest. What if Michael went to prison? What if Lauren lost the baby from stress? What if our family never recovered from this, but alongside the fear came another feeling too? Truth. For the first time in years, lies were finally collapsing. And strange as it sounds, truth brings relief, even when it hurts. Federal investigators officially opened inquiries into several Whitaker development projects by late January. The news spread quietly through Santa Fe business circles first, then publicly, then explosively. One morning, I turned on the television and nearly dropped my coffee mug when Edward Whitaker's company appeared across local news headlines. Commercial fraud allegations under review. Potential investor misrepresentation. Financial exposure concerns. The mighty Whitaker empire suddenly looked fragile, and Edward responded exactly the way men like him always do when power slips. He started sacrificing people, including Michael. Angela called me immediately after the story broke. You need to come to my office. Fear rushed through me all over again. When I arrived, Michael was already there, sitting beside Lauren. Neither looked like themselves anymore. The polished image was gone. Lauren wore no makeup. Michael looked 10 years older. But something else was gone too. The arrogance. For the first time since their marriage began, they looked like ordinary, frightened young people instead of people desperately performing wealth. Angela closed the office door carefully. Edward's attorneys are attempting to separate liability exposure, she explained. Michael laughed bitterly, meaning they're throwing me overboard. Lauren started crying quietly beside him. They're saying Michael handled certain partnership authorizations independently. My stomach dropped. That's not true. No, Angela agreed calmly. But proving manipulation takes time. Michael leaned forward miserably. I signed everything. His voice sounded hollow now. I should have listened to Dad. Tears stung my eyes instantly. Because underneath all the destruction, all the betrayal, all the humiliation, he still missed his father too. Lauren suddenly looked toward me. For weeks after Christmas, she barely met my eyes. Now she looked shattered. Krista, she whispered. I'm sorry. The pain in her voice sounded real, not performative. Real. I was horrible to you. I stayed quiet, because some apologies deserve silence before acceptance. Lauren wiped tears from her cheeks. My father convinced me you were trying to control Michael financially. He kept saying you resented our success. Angela snorted softly. What success? The entire structure was collapsing. Lauren looked sick hearing that aloud. Then quietly, she admitted something that hurt more than I expected. I thought if Michael became successful enough, my father would finally respect him. There it was again. The same poison. Edward Whittaker built entire relationships around withheld approval. No wonder Michael and Lauren became addicted to chasing it. Lauren covered her face with trembling hands. I let him turn us into people I don't even recognize anymore. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. Edward didn't just manipulate businesses, he manipulated identity, families, self-worth. That afternoon, Michael officially began cooperating with investigators through Angela's guidance. The process was humiliating for him. Public scrutiny, financial audits, destroyed partnerships, friends disappearing overnight. But slowly, something unexpected began happening too. My son started telling the truth. Really telling it. Not polishing it. Not performing strength. Truth. And truth changed him. One evening in February, Michael came over to help shovel snow from my driveway. Halfway through, he leaned against the shovel, breathing heavily, and laughed weakly. You know what's pathetic? What I spent years trying to impress people who vanished, the second money got shaky. I smiled sadly. Real love behaves differently during hardship. Michael nodded slowly. I know that now. Then quietly he added, You and Dad were the only people who ever loved me before I became useful. That sentence nearly broke me, because it explained so much. The insecurity, the desperation, the hunger for validation. Some wounds begin in childhood, long before parents realize they exist. Miguel and I loved Michael deeply, but maybe we accidentally taught him that achievement created worth. Maybe he learned early that failing meant disappointing people, and Edward Whittaker weaponized that fear masterfully. By March, several Whittaker properties were under active investigation. Patricia quietly filed for legal separation. Lauren stopped speaking to her father almost entirely, and Edward turned vicious. Newspapers started receiving anonymous tips blaming Michael for financial irregularities. Old business contacts suddenly stopped returning calls. Even Lauren received cruel messages online accusing her of marrying beneath her social status. The same society people who once adored the Whittakers suddenly treated them like contamination. Watching it happen taught me something ugly about wealth. The people obsessed with status rarely stay loyal once status disappears. But the hardest moment came unexpectedly one rainy afternoon. Michael arrived at my house carrying a cardboard box. What's that? I asked. Without answering, he placed it carefully on the kitchen table and opened it. Inside sat expensive watches, designer belts, luxury shoes, even his Rolex. I frowned in confusion. What are you doing? He shrugged weakly. Selling things. Pain twisted through my chest. Michael, I need liquidity until we stabilize the company. Then he laughed quietly. You know what's funny? What I used to think owning these things meant I'd finally made it. He picked up the Rolex slowly. Dad's old truck made him happier than this watch ever made me. Tears filled my eyes instantly, because that was true. Miguel found joy in ordinary things: barbecues, baseball games, family dinners, love. And somehow our son got lost trying to trade all of that for acceptance from people who never valued him. A few weeks later, Michael made another decision that shocked me. He withdrew from the Whittaker investment structures entirely and reopened his business under a smaller independent model. No luxury expansion, no risky development partnerships, just honest construction work again. The same kind of work Miguel once taught him proudly. When he told me I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not complete peace, but the beginning of it. He said quietly one afternoon, while helping me repair a kitchen cabinet, I spent so many years trying not to become dad. I looked up sharply. What Michael smiled sadly. I thought his life was too small. Tears instantly blurred my vision. Then he whispered, but he was actually the strongest man I ever knew. That was the moment I finally believed my son might truly change. Not because he was suffering consequences, because humility was finally reaching him. And strangely enough, losing everything false seemed to be the first step toward finding himself again. The next Christmas arrived quietly. No luxury catering, no valet parking, no polished performances pretending to be happiness. Just snow falling softly across Albuquerque and the smell of cinnamon roasted chili and fresh tamales filling my little house again. And for the first time in years, peace. Not perfect peace. Life doesn't work that way. Too much had happened for simple, happy endings. Edward Whitaker was still under federal investigation. Several business assets had been frozen, and most of the powerful friends who once crowded around him disappeared almost overnight. Patricia moved into a condo in Arizona. Lauren rarely spoke about her father anymore. And Michael was rebuilding his life from the ground up, literally. He now worked directly alongside his construction crew again, instead of chasing luxury investors and expansion fantasies. The company was smaller, humbler, and nowhere near as profitable as before. But every time I saw him lately, he looked lighter somehow, like a man finally breathing with his own lungs instead of someone else's approval. And then there was Sophia, my granddaughter, the tiny little girl who somehow stitched broken pieces of all our hearts together simply by existing. The first time Michael placed her in my arms 6 months earlier, I cried so hard I could barely hold her. Not because everything was magically healed, but because life had given us another chance before it was too late. Now, 1 year after the worst Christmas of my life, I stood in my kitchen tying my apron while Sophia slept peacefully in a small bassinet near the fireplace. Soft Spanish music played quietly through the house. Miguel's old recipes covered the counter. And for the first time since he died, Christmas felt warm again. A knock sounded at the front door around 4 in the afternoon. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Michael stood there holding a pie box awkwardly beneath one arm while snow dusted his jacket shoulders. "Hey, Mom." For one tiny second, my heart squeezed painfully, because suddenly I saw every version of him at once again. The boy who used to race downstairs on Christmas morning, the man who broke my heart at the dinner table, and the humbled soul standing quietly in front of me now. "Come in," I said softly. This time he hugged me first. Not quickly, not politely, really hugged me. And I realized something important in that moment. When love becomes genuine again, you feel it immediately. Lauren entered behind him carrying baby supplies, while little Sophia blinked sleepily from her car seat. Lauren looked different too. Softer somehow. Less polished. More real. Motherhood had stripped something artificial away from her. "Merry Christmas, Krista," she said gently. "Merry Christmas." She hesitated for a second before quietly adding, "The tamales smell amazing." That made me smile despite myself. "Well," I replied softly, I figured this year nobody would stop me from bringing them. The pain that crossed Michael's face told me he remembered the Christmas tray sitting untouched in my car. Good. Some memories should hurt forever, not to destroy us, to teach us. Dinner preparation passed quietly and comfortably. Michael helped set the table without being asked. Lauren rocked Sophia near the fireplace, while Christmas music drifted softly through the house. Nothing about the evening looked impressive. The dishes didn't match perfectly. The dining table was old. The house itself was modest compared to the Whitaker mansion. But unlike last Christmas, this home felt full. At one point, Michael stopped in front of the framed photograph of Miguel hanging beside the hallway. He stared at it for a long time, then quietly whispered, "I wish he could see me now." I walked over slowly. "He can." Michael looked down. I failed him. "No?" I said softly. "You lost yourself for a while." Tears filled his eyes immediately. "That's worse." I touched his arm gently. "The important part is that you found your way back." He nodded slowly, but didn't speak, because some guilt never disappears completely. And honestly, maybe it shouldn't. By 6 o'clock, dinner was finally ready. Snow fell heavily outside, while warm light filled the dining room. For a moment, I stood in the kitchen doorway, simply looking at the table. A simple table. Nothing fancy. No crystal glasses. No wealthy guests. No performance. Just family. Real family. And suddenly my chest tightened unexpectedly, because I remembered another table, another Christmas, another chair. The memory still hurt. Maybe it always would. Michael seemed to sense exactly what I was thinking, because he suddenly froze beside the dining room entrance. Everyone else sat down slowly, but he remained standing, silent, nervous. Then finally, he looked directly at me. "Mom?" His voice cracked slightly. "May I sit here?" He gestured toward the chair beside mine, the same seat, the same place where everything shattered a year earlier. For several seconds, nobody moved. Lauren looked emotional instantly. Even baby Sophia stirred softly in her bassinet nearby. And standing there in the warm glow of my dining room, I realized this moment wasn't really about forgiveness anymore. It was about dignity, about boundaries, about understanding that love without respect eventually destroys people. Slowly, I walked toward the chair. Michael looked terrified suddenly, not of rejection, of understanding the full weight of what he'd done. I placed my hand gently on the back of the chair, then pulled it out for him. "You may sit beside me," I said softly. Tears filled his eyes instantly, but never mistake forgiveness for permission to hurt me again. His face crumpled completely. "I won't," he whispered. "I know." And surprisingly, I meant it, because my son finally understood something he never understood before. A mother's love is powerful, but her dignity matters too. Michael sat beside me slowly, while tears slipped silently down his face. Then, before dinner even began, he quietly reached into his jacket pocket and placed something small beside my plate. Miguel's silver watch, the one I tried to give him last Christmas. I looked at it in stunned silence. "You should keep it," I whispered. He shook his head immediately. "No." His voice trembled. "I spent too many years trying to become someone else." He looked toward Miguel's photograph again. "But I finally understand who I actually wanted to be." That broke me completely. I started crying. Lauren started crying. Even Michael laughed weakly through his tears. And suddenly, little Sophia began crying too loud and dramatic, like she wanted to join the emotional chaos herself. We all burst into laughter at the exact same time. Real laughter, messy laughter, healing laughter. The kind families fight hard to earn back after surviving each other. Later that night, after dinner ended, and snow covered the streets outside, I stood alone for a moment beside the dining room table. The same kind of table that once held my deepest humiliation now held something entirely different: peace. Not because everything was forgotten, but because truth finally replaced performance. And as I looked around my warm little house, filled with imperfect but genuine love, I realized something beautiful at last. I no longer needed anyone's permission to belong. Not Michael's, not Edward Whitaker's, not society's. Because after all the heartbreak, humiliation, and grief, I had finally built a life where no one could ever push me away from my own table again. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak in life does not come from strangers. It comes from the people we once loved enough to sacrifice everything for. This story is not really about a chair at a Christmas table. It is about something much bigger: dignity, self-worth, forgiveness, and the painful moment when a person realizes they have spent too many years shrinking themselves just to keep the peace. So many parents, especially mothers, spend their entire lives giving without limits. They work themselves to exhaustion, forgive endlessly, and convince themselves that love means enduring anything. But real love should never require humiliation. And growing older does not mean becoming less valuable, less important, or easier to discard. Krista's story reminds us that kindness and weakness are not the same thing. There comes a moment in life when protecting your peace becomes necessary. Not because you stop loving your family, but because you finally understand that love without respect slowly destroys the soul. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this: people can lose themselves chasing approval from the wrong crowd. Money, status, and appearances can become dangerous addictions when someone secretly feels unworthy inside. Michael did terrible things, but underneath his mistakes was a broken man desperate to feel accepted. Healing only began when truth finally replaced pride. Forgiveness also does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending the wounds never happened. True forgiveness comes with wisdom, boundaries, and self-respect. By the end of this story, Krista did not win because she defeated someone wealthy or powerful. She won because she finally stopped begging for a seat at someone else's table and realized she was worthy of building her own. And honestly, that is a lesson many of us need to hear. If this story touched your heart, I would truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible or disrespected by someone you deeply loved? What would you have done if you were in Krista's position? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about family healing, strength, and self-worth, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more emotional journeys together. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there right now?